We put a $300 receiver, an $800 receiver, and a $2,500 receiver in the same room for 30 days. Same speakers, same source, same listening chair. One of them started sounding thin by day 15, and it wasn't the cheapest one. Prices mentioned are US-based estimates. Check your local market. Here's the setup. A Sony STRD-H790, a Denon AVRX 2700H, and a Yamaha Avantage RX6A, rotated through the same two-channel system every day for a month. No cherry-picked listening sessions, no A-B switching tricks, just 30 days of actual use the way a real buyer would live with any of these. Same pair of bookshelf speakers connected to each receiver in turn, same streaming source, same room, same seat, and the volume level held constant across all three so that loudness itself was never the variable doing the work. Each receiver got 10 consecutive days in rotation rather than a single day each, specifically so that any weakness that only shows up under sustained thermal load rather than a cold start would have time to surface. Run the numbers before the sound even starts. The Sony costs roughly $2 per rated watt. The Denon costs closer to $4 per rated watt, nearly double, for a power supply that actually sustains its output under real load instead of only matching it on a cold test bench. The Yamaha costs almost $9 per rated watt, more than 4 times the Sony's ratio. And by the end of this test, you'll see exactly which part of that premium is engineering and which part is a menu screen nobody bothered to open. Day 1, all 3 sound competent. That's the part nobody tells you going in. A $300 receiver in 2026 is not a bad receiver. Sony's engineering heritage in professional broadcast monitoring is real, and some of that discipline shows up even in the entry consumer line. The STRD-H790 drives a pair of bookshelf speakers cleanly at moderate volume, and on day 1 in a quiet room, most people would struggle to pick it out of a lineup. Its switching power supply is rated at 145 watts per channel, a single-channel figure measured under test bench conditions that have very little to do with how a receiver behaves after a week of daily use. Sony's broadcast monitor division still builds equipment specified by professional facilities worldwide, and the entry receiver line borrows that badge without carrying the same engineering budget into the chassis. The Denon sounds slightly more controlled in the bass on day 1, a difference you'd only notice switching directly between them. The AVRX 2700H uses a more substantial power supply than its price tag might suggest. The kind of over-engineering Denon's electronics division has quietly maintained even as its speaker line drifted toward cost-cutting under the same corporate ownership. The Yamaha sounds the most relaxed, the least fatiguing at higher volumes, though on day 1 that's a subtle enough difference that it barely registers as an advantage worth the price gap. The Class A/AB amplification and H-shaped anti-resonance chassis of the RX-A6A are genuine engineering investments, not marketing language. Day 8 is where the switching power supply in the Sony starts to matter. Under sustained use at real listening volumes rather than a 5-minute demo, the power delivery of the STRD-H790 shows its limits. Bass notes that were tight on day 1 start losing definition at anything above conversational volume. This isn't a defect, it's the specification sheet doing exactly what it was built to do. Perform well under the light test conditions the number was measured against, and perform adequately, not impressively, under the conditions of actual daily listening. Technicians who service entry-level receivers see this pattern constantly, a switching power supply that measures fine, cold, and briefly, but sags under the thermal load of hours of continuous use. the Denon holds its ground through day 8 without meaningful change. The Class D amplification inside the X2700H is a step up from entry-level switching designs, and the toroidal transformer keeps the sustained output more honest than the Sony's figure suggests on paper. Nothing about the Denon demands attention at this stage, which 30 days into a test built around finding the moment something breaks or reveals itself, is itself a meaningful result. It is worth noting that Denon's electronics division has maintained more engineering continuity through its ownership changes than the company's speaker line has, a distinction that matters when you're specifically buying the receiver and nothing else. By day 15, something happens that the spec sheets never predicted. The Yamaha, the most expensive of the three, starts to reveal a limitation of its own, just a different kind. The Aventage's anti-resonance chassis and discrete amplification stages are genuinely engineered, no argument there. But at this price point, Yamaha loads the RX A6A with processing options, room correction algorithms, and a menu system deep enough that most owners never configure it correctly. Out of the box with default settings, the Yamaha's room correction slightly overcompensates in a small listening space, adding a faint boxiness that a $2,500 receiver should not introduce. It is not a hardware failure. It is a software default tuned for a showroom demo, not your living room, and it took a full 2 weeks of daily listening before the pattern became consistent enough to be certain it wasn't just an off night. Yamaha's engineers built genuinely capable room correction technology into this receiver. Whoever set the factory default correction curve prioritized impressing a showroom floor over serving an actual living room. And those are two different acoustic environments with two different correct answers. Day 22 is where the Denon's one real limitation finally shows up, and it's worth being honest about it rather than pretending the mid-tier receiver won every category. The AVR X2700H's onboard room correction is genuinely less sophisticated than the Yamaha's, even accounting for the Yamaha's default setting problem. In a room with more acoustic irregularities than the test space, a corner-heavy listening room, or an unusually reflective surface nearby, the Denon's correction algorithm would likely need to be supplemented with manual equalization adjustment to match what the Yamaha can eventually achieve once properly configured, a limitation that only becomes obvious once you've lived with both receivers long enough to compare them in more than one kind of room. That's not a defect. It's a genuine tier difference between an $800 receiver and a $2,500 one, and it's the one place in this entire test where the price gap actually predicts the outcome cleanly. No sponsored gear, no manufacturer relationships, just what the technicians know. Before the day 30 results, subscribe now if this is the kind of breakdown you want more of. Quick question. Have you ever assumed the most expensive component in your system was automatically the one working correctly, without ever opening the settings menu to check? By day 30, the picture is clear, and it's not the picture any of the three brands would put in their marketing. None of the three receivers failed catastrophically over the full month. Nothing shut off, nothing burned out, nothing needed a warranty claim or a technician's visit. The Sony has genuinely lost ground. Sustained daily use at real volumes is where its switching power supply's limitations compound, and by the end of the month, the difference between it and the Denon is no longer subtle. It's the kind of gap you'd notice on a first listen, not just in a side-by-side comparison. The Denon is the receiver that changed the least across all 30 days, the same controlled, honest sound on day 30 that it had on day 1. The Yamaha, once its room correction is manually recalibrated instead of left on default, moves ahead of both the anti-resonance chassis and discrete output stages, finally doing what the price tag promised, but only after someone bothered to open the settings menu and turn the automatic correction down. Sony STR DH790. Verdict: competent for the first week, measurably weaker by the end of the month under real sustained use. The switching power supply that looked fine on a spec sheet is the first thing to show strain when the receiver actually has to work for 30 straight days rather than a single demo session. $2 per rated watt buys you real performance for exactly as long as you're not asking the receiver to sustain it, which most showroom demos never test and most buyers never think to ask about before they hand over the money. Buy this if you need a genuinely low-cost receiver for occasional or low-volume listening. Avoid it if you're planning to run it daily at real listening volumes for years. The power supply inside is built for light duty, not sustained use. Denon AVR X2700H. Verdict. The most consistent performer across the entire test, the receiver that sounded the same on day 30 as it did on day 1, which is a harder engineering achievement than it sounds, and one none of the marketing for any of these three receivers actually advertises. $4 per rated watt turned out to be the most honestly spent money in this entire test, precisely because nothing about it needed a settings menu to deliver what the price tag promised on day 1. Buy this if you want dependable performance without needing to configure anything to get it. Avoid it if you specifically need the deepest room correction or the most granular manual control, because that's where the Yamaha, once tuned, pulls ahead. Yamaha Avantage RX A6A. Verdict. The best receiver in this test, but only for the buyer willing to spend 20 minutes in the settings menu, correcting what the default room correction gets wrong. Out of the box, it underperforms its own price tag for the first 2 weeks of ownership. Configured properly, it earns every dollar of the gap between it and the other two. And the $9 per rated watt finally starts to make sense once the software stops undermining hardware that was genuinely engineered to justify the number. Buy this if your budget reaches this tier and you're willing to manually tune the room correction rather than trust the automatic default. Avoid it if you want a receiver that performs at its best straight out of the box with zero setup, because that is not what this price point delivers here, whatever the marketing implies about automatic calibration. 20 minutes with the manual is the actual price of admission. This receiver never lists next to the dollar figure on the box. Here's the principle worth taking from 30 days instead of 30 minutes in a showroom. Price predicts build quality reasonably well. It does not predict which mistakes a manufacturer makes, and every receiver in this test made one just at different points in the month and for different reasons entirely. A 1-week review would have crowned the Yamaha the obvious winner on day 1 and never caught the room correction problem. A teardown looking only at components would have crowned the Denon or Yamaha and never caught how genuinely fine the Sony sounds for the first several days. Time is the only test none of these three receivers could market their way around. 3 words: sustained, configured, consistent. The Sony failed sustained. The Yamaha failed configured until it wasn't. The Denon never failed either test, which says more about Denon's engineering priorities than any single spec on the box ever could tell you, and more than a 30-minute showroom demo would ever have the time to reveal. Which one surprised you most? The cheap one that faded, or the expensive one that needed help? Drop it below. See you next time.